evening, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday night segment of The Outer Realm with myself, Michelle Desrochers and Amelia Pisano. We are broadcasting live here on the United Public Radio Network, 107.7 FM in New Orleans. So,
sorry, that's me. Sorry,
I'm having an echo. I must be in another.
Button.
I must be in a dimensional something or other here.
Oh, I've got the iPad and the iPhone, and they have opposite sides. Sorry.
Okay. Just a reminder, everybody, pop on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe, first of all. But that's where the chat room is going to be. So you want to be in the United Public Radio chat room, and you have to be logged in to be able to communicate with us. So let's do that, and let's get the show on the road. And before I do that, big, huge shout out to the amazing folks over at Folgers Coffee who do partially sponsor tonight's segment. Thank you, Folgers. And there, that kind of threw me off a little bit, but I'm all right. It's a little bit of a recovery and back on track. So,
I posted the link on our Facebook page, and of course, I was able to tag us this time, and yet I still can't see it. And it doesn't have Michelle is blacked out. So I'm going to share it on the timeline.
That's very strange. I don't see it at all. So we just
because you're blacked out, and I understand why.
Huh.
Okay.
That's different.
That's okay. I'm going to share it now. I'm going to share it again.
Okay.
On my own timeline and see if this will make a difference. And now I can tag again, and we'll do it from here.
Perfect. So, of course, you have like an amazing guest again tonight. We have so many like amazing guests. I'm just so it's honored and grateful that they're, we get so many requests and we have so many people, accept the invitations. And A.P. Sylvia is just one of those people that I am really thrilled to have join us. And just so y'all know, we're talking vampires tonight. New Orleans is littered with vampires. So I'm just really looking forward to this.
You would think they're very comfortable with it.
Yes, just a little bit. Okay, hold on. I got to go to accept this tag. Yeah,
yes.
I'm really, I am mega looking forward to it. There we go, people, all accepted. And, just because of the fact that, it's something that I've always had an interest from a very young age. And I've done shows where I've talked about it myself, probably not to the extent that AP will talk about it. So I'm really, I love hearing people's different perspectives and ideas. And he wrote a book about it. So we know that there's going to be a lot of info in there. And while we wait for him, why don't you let me know when you're ready to get in there and do a big old intro.
Absolutely. And you've heard some of it from Michelle. It's amazing. Our guest tonight has long been interested in the supernatural, beliefs and origins, exploring essential texts of vampire folklore. We're going to ask him what that means, and visited many vampire-related locations. Please welcome tonight researcher and author. I want to say he's world traveler of Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, Mr. A.P. Sylvia, to the Outer Realm.
Ooh, I like that. Modern misconceptions. Yeah.
Hey, Joe.
There we go.
Here we
There
go.
There he is. Hello. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Hello, how are you?
Well, thank you. Nice to see you. So I have to say I've been extremely excited about the show, and we don't often get a lot of people who come forward and want to talk about vampires the way you want to talk about vampires. Usually they'll come in and look at them as some kind of cryptid or something. It's like, well, I don't know if they were constituted as a cryptid.
Some kind of.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time in Romania. I spent about a month there and thought to myself, I don't know. This is, it's possible. A lot of portals around here. They could pop in and out, right? Because with every little bit of folklore comes maybe a little, does it come with a little grain of truth of a sighting?
Well, you do wonder about that sort of thing. It's hard to say. There are certainly a lot of different beliefs surrounding vampires, in Eastern Europe and actually in a number of different countries beyond that region. And that was something I found interesting doing my research about vampires, is that you find these kinds of stories in a number of different places. This where the dead are coming back and they're, tormenting the living in some fashion.
Mm. Well, I completely agree with you. Like I said, I've been, sort of a diehard, vampire fan, I guess, from a very young age, and have done a lot of studying myself. And I always look forward to, what other people come up with. So, why vampires?
Yeah, well, I've been interested in different supernatural beliefs and the paranormal ever since I was a little kid. I liked spooky books and things like that. And even when I was small, my mother bought me like this book on ghosts. It was like a fun facts book on ghosts at the Children's
Wow.
Museum. And I ran across it recently. So
Wow.
I've always had the sort of this curiosity surrounding these kinds of things. When it comes to vampires, what really got me on that track was a few years ago now. I was in New York City, and I was walking around Times Square with my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and we came upon Ripley's Believe It or Not museum. And I'm not sure if you've ever been to one of those. They're a lot
I
of fun.
have.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
I've been to a number of them, and they're just so enjoyable. So we came upon that, and I was like, we must go in. Uh,
That's it.
yes.
I'm the husband. I speak.
Yeah.
We're going in.
No, she was game. She's always game. So we
Well, she'd have to be with you though, right? Like she could.
exactly.
That's a lot of differences if you don't agree on that.
Stroke that ego.
Yeah.
So we can go inside, and obviously there's all kinds of fun different objects and exhibits, peculiar things and oddities and the like. And one of the things they had there that really caught my eye was this antique box with these vials in it and a stake and a cross and stuff, and it was
Wow.
labeled as an antique vampire killing kit. And according to the card, these were sold in the 1800s to travelers who were going to go to Eastern Europe and that kind of thing. And just
That's
the
wild.
yeah, the whole aesthetic of the kit was just fantastic. It looked great. And so afterwards, I was kind of thinking back on that particular object. I was like, I want to learn more about this thing. And so I took to the internet, and I started reading some different articles about it, and I actually found out that there was a little bit of controversy surrounding them. Some people maintain that they are authentic pieces. Other people argue that they are actually 20th century productions using vintage parts. So, maybe someone took a box from the 1800s and, a stick, and they made a stake out of it, and that kind of thing, and assembled it all together.
So
And
like
then like,
an antique reproduction sort of
yeah,
thing.
yeah, like as if
Right.
someone was trying to reproduce
Yeah.
something, but that never existed to begin with. So it has these vintage parts,
Yeah.
but perhaps was not from that time period. That's what some
Right.
people were arguing.
Yeah.
And one of
Yeah.
the arguments for that was that, oh, well, these kits kind of represent, movies and kind of modern notions about vampires and don't really reflect folklore. And it was that argument about, well, this is movie vampires, not folklore, that really got me thinking, like, well, what are the differences between what we think about with, pop culture vampires and what the actual beliefs of the past were? And I knew there were some differences, just based on, documentaries I had seen and things like that. And I kind of set out, I was wondering, like, well, someone give me a list. Someone kind of break it down for me. I want to kind of go through all the different traits that we associate with vampires and what's kind of, quote unquote real, what are actual beliefs, real beliefs of the past versus, kind of modern inventions or something like that. And I
Mm.
couldn't really find that list. I couldn't find that breakdown. And so I started kind of doing research and reading, and I sort of wound up writing the book that I wanted to read. And that's how I arrived at my book, Vampires of Lore.
Wow.
And let me guess, none of them sparkle like diamonds, right?
No, not really. That doesn't really come up. The kind of
Mm.
a alluring vampire that we think of today isn't really found in folklore.
No, that's true. It was pretty harsh, actually. In reference to the kit, I once filmed with a man who bought out the old Niagara Falls Museum of Oddities that went back from the 1800s. They had real mummies. He ended up with 8 mummies. In fact, he had been the owner of King Ramses the First, and never knew it.
Wow.
So he has a crazy story. But when I filmed with him, he had a vampire hunting kit from Brazil, and it was really old. And I think, it's like you said, it was obviously, you have to have a vampire to have a kit, but I think it just fell into the whole frenzy, the fear factor, of the lore, because I mean, I'm sure, as you get into things, I think these things may have started coming into production in and around, the 1800s, just because people were just terrified. Like you say, it's just, were they ever used? Doubtfully. But I thought it was an interesting piece also.
I mean,
much like yourself.
Yeah, I love the aesthetic. And, to me, whether they're of the time period or whether they are, from the 20th century and were assembled, I think they're just a testament to how how prevalent and powerful vampire beliefs are in our culture, regardless of whether it was the past or the present.
No, I agree with you. So how does one go about delving into vampire folklore? Because if you look online, I mean, let's face it, most of it is a lot of just cinematic stuff, right?
Yeah, so you need to be very judicious in terms of kind of the sources you're using when you're starting to delve into vampires. If you just start reading things online, there's a lot of stuff online, right? There's a lot of articles and things, and some are some maybe scholarly, some maybe not so much. So for me, what I was trying to do is I was trying to go back as far as I could and get look at source material that was, pre-20th century, 1800s, 1700s, if I could. Basically as far back as I could go to try to get away from the kind of contamination that our modern vampire notions introduce. I mean, there were kind of times where I might read an account, like an old account, right? But it was an a kind of a more modern summary of it or something, and would have some of these kind of things that we'd associate with modern vampires, like, oh, interesting. But then I'd read an older version of the tale, and suddenly it was different, and suddenly some of these things weren't there anymore. And so I think sometimes people will, if they're kind of summarizing it or retelling it or something, may knowingly or not inject their own preconceived notions about vampires into what they're saying, because it is because the imagery is just so prevalent. So I was trying. So my thing was like, well, let me just try to go back as far as I could. So I was looking at older sources, 1800s, 1700s, however far back I could. I mean, one of the oldest accounts I looked at was actually from the 12th century. So they go back, vampire beliefs or beliefs in the undead go back quite a ways. And then so in my book, I actually wound up there's the bibliography. I think there's over like 90 sources in there that I used.
Wow.
And I tried to, and in the book, whenever I sort of talk about a vampire belief or something, like, oh, well, there was a belief here in this, I always put like endnotes that say where I got that from, because that's another thing I noticed too in my research. Sometimes you read something in a book or somewhere, and they say, oh, that people believe this. I was like, oh, wow, interesting. Where'd you find that? And I don't know. It was just they were just saying it. So then it's like, well, I don't know where that came from. So for me, for my book, I was trying to say like, well, everything I say, I'm giving you the source of where I found it. So for those people that want to learn more or take it to the next level or something like that, they can do that. And I've given them the path for that if they'd like that.
It's very generous of you. What was one of the first things that just shocked you, that went completely against and debunked? I hate that word, but it's the only one I can find right now.
Yeah.
A theory or a thought that you've had your entire life, and you start researching and you're like, what just happened?
Damn.
Give us an example of one of those. Yeah.
Sure. Well, so I went trait by trait. So some traits, I found evidence. I have evidence in folklore for. Some traits I did not. So one trait that I would say is probably one of the most ubiquitous things about it's in every sort of vampire movie, more or less, are the fangs, right? That's sort of quintessential piece of imagery. If you're watching a TV show or something like that, and somebody looks at the camera in a sinister way, and they smile and they have the two extended canines, you're like, oh, it's a vampire. Right, like that's all you need. That's all.
Right.
You don't.
Yeah.
They don't need to. You don't need to see anything else. You're like, oh,
Classic.
vampire. Boom.
Classic.
And so it comes as a surprise that actually that image of the extended canines of the fangs is not present in folklore. They're actually the kind of the two incision marks in the neck that again is this iconic thing, also not found in folklore, which I think it comes as a surprise to a lot of people. That, what do you mean vampires don't have fangs? Like that, of course they have fangs. I've seen movies, but when you read
werewolves do.
there you go.
But vampires don't.
Yeah, so I think that comes as a surprise. The accounts never mention fangs. When it talks, there are some accounts that mention like a wound on the neck or something, but that's one wound, not two bite marks or incisions. There was a belief. There's one particular belief where it said the vampire had like a barb on its tongue, like a stinger, which I thought was kind of interesting. That was kind of a one-off belief.
It varies, doesn't it, from culture to culture?
Oh, absolutely. There's not sort of one pure definition of here's a vampire and here's everything about it. As you go from different places and different time periods, different cultures, you're going to see different aspects of vampires and different beliefs surrounding them. And I think these beliefs, they evolve and change over time, and they interact with other beliefs. One of the last chapters of my book is about beliefs about witches and werewolves and how they relate to vampires, because there's actually they kind of influence each other, these beliefs. When we watch movies and stuff, we put things into boxes, right? Like, this is a werewolf and this is what it does. This is a vampire. This is an evil, a malevolent witch, right? I'm talking about the malevolent witches of folklore here.
Yes.
That's in this box. But when you actually look at the beliefs of different cultures, they're influencing each other over time. And so something that was associated to witches might also be associated to vampires, or might be associated to werewolves. And so that was interesting as well, that there aren't these kind of hard and fast lines around them, that they all populated this kind of rich spiritual belief system that people had.
No, I agree. Do you find, what I find fascinating is how, let's face it, back in the day, people weren't traveling literally all over Europe on an average, especially town folk, but I find it interesting how the concept is much the same in all different parts that are, from Greece, let's say, to Eastern Europe and Romania. I mean, that's a hike, and yet they're still very, very similar.
It is fascinating that you get this belief like popping up in different places, whether it was Greece, which has a strong tradition of vampires, where they're known as the Vrichalakis there, Eastern Europe, going to even to the Great Britain. I thought there are stories in Great Britain about the undead, and then even made the jump to the New World. There are accounts from New England, and so I think part of the reason why you find it in all these different places, because I think it speaks to something very sort of fundamental and core to humanity, to the psyche, about this fear of the dead. Fear of death, and then ultimately fear of the dead, and what the dead may do to you, and how they may bring you to death because they themselves are dead. I think there's something there. And also another thing I talk about in the book is when you read some of these accounts, and some of these accounts, like some of them are very old and they're kind of shrouded in the mists of time, but others are, there were newspaper articles about these things. And when you look at some of them, some of the things they're describing are actually misunderstandings regarding disease and the decomposition process.
Yes.
So people are seeing things that they don't understand, that doesn't make sense to them based upon their knowledge of the world. And so they're trying to make sense of it. And they're looking at it through a supernatural or a spiritual lens. And and vampires is where they're arriving on it.
Yeah, no, for sure. For sure. Sorry, Amelia, were you going to ask something? You look
No,
like you're
I
just
was
kind
gonna
of
say.
okay.
Well, I'm waiting. No, I don't want to. I don't want to rush it. I was
Yeah.
gonna ask. I know it's hard because we have a leg, so
Yeah.
it's like if my finger goes up, Michelle knows.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you, what was your first view?
My first view, like
Yeah, your first opinion of, did you feel like it was supernatural? Did you feel it was something real before you dug in?
well, it's a big world out there, so you never know what to expect, right? I think some of the aspects of vampire accounts where someone's being visited by the dead or something like that can fit into various kind of supernatural or spiritual beliefs and that kind of thing. So I think it becomes a matter of spiritual interpretation. For me, I never, when I was young, I didn't really probably think. I thought they were more just kind of maybe stories. I think our in our culture we tend to focus more on like ghosts and spirits, right? Like that tends to be more of the thing. There's a physicality to vampires that I don't think necessarily resonates with a lot of folks today. I think we tend to more focus on more the ethereal. So it's been a learning. It's certainly been a learning experience to see how people have interpreted things, and sort of when you first think about people's belief in vampires, you don't necessarily tend to think they were rooted in actual events. Maybe there's like, oh, they believed in these things, but they didn't necessarily have proof or evidence, right? Well, to their minds, they did have actual proof. That's they would look at that and go, there's your proof right there that something is amiss in our community. There's a danger to us. People are getting sick, people are dying. They would exhume these the corpses of the dead, because they would, when you put yourself in their mindset, they were saying, well, all this started when this one person got sick and died. And well, let's dig them up and let's see that it all began here. Let's take a look. And they would exhume these bodies and they would see things that they weren't expecting, and thus they arrived at it. So I think that was kind of that was fascinating to learn about how they were trying to make sense of their world. There was more there than just kind of this kind of like mysterious kind of story shrouded, kind of mists of time sort of thing where you don't know where it came from. It's like, oh, you can see their logic of how they got there, which is fascinating.
Of course. And you use that keyword story because a lot of people would tell their children, their fairy tales were very horrific. In the original Cinderella, they cut the stepsister's foot off to fit the shoe. Like, there's so many things people don't realize. But they did tell these stories because they didn't want their kids getting out of bed. They thought they could keep them there. And some of those stories have included vampires and werewolves. I've always believed that there's some kind of group out there that has certain practices, whether they be it supernatural or not.
Portals.
Yeah, I know a lot of humans that practice vampirism. So
yeah, but I think it's just so different now. Like, I know I've been spending some time. I've been fortunate to travel extensively, and Romania being one of those places. If you talk to the younger generation, they kind of like, but the older generation, like they're pretty fearful, right down to how they bury the dead, when they bury the dead. There's parts of Romania you can go to, and oh no, on the night of the full moon, if you go to Brasov, the night of the full moon, when it happens, everybody clears out of the square because the wolves come down from the mountain. Like, this is still really embedded into a lot of older generations. And of course, then, you immigrate to this side of the world, and that belief system comes with you.
It doesn't go away. It's not like you leave it all behind. I actually talk about one story. It made the international press. It was in the 2000s where it was a rural village in Romania where someone was exhumed because they thought that this person was a vampire and was kind of terrorizing the living. So I think in some places with some people, these beliefs are still around, and I think it's a testament to the power and the presence in the culture.
I always feel like there's some sort of demonic side to it as well. Like you can really tie them into anything supernatural, but there are some traits that are demonic with them. Zachman had put in the chat room, which was a really good point too, his thoughts when he looks at it, vampires could be interpreted as another version of a zombie.
Yeah, I think
his opinion, and it's a good point.
True,
yeah.
I mean,
Walking Dead.
The Walking Dead, absolutely. Like, I think it's,
I
our
never
modern
watched that,
notions of zombies can kind of fit into some of the, the more traditional notions of vampires, where you have this corpse that's kind of walking around, bothering people in various ways. The cape wearing vampire who is in modern movies and stuff, there's this whole kind of
tuxedo vampire,
and there's like these groups of
yeah,
vampires
that's what I
having
call them.
parties and stuff like that, drinking wine and like living lives. They have like a whole life that the vampires live in movies, and things like that. Where they have social engagements and stuff. That you don't find that in folklore. That there was nothing romantic about them. They were to be feared. There was something. They were a real threat, and you need to watch out for them. In like 19th century literature, that's when the vampire shifted to being this kind of romantic figure who's going to soirees, and now you had to watch out because you might have a vampire in your parlor, enjoying a party with high society, and that resonated with the readers of like the Victorian period.
Oh, but they loved anything macabre. I mean, ghost stories at Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
They invented, the spiritualist movement, having picnics in cemeteries. Like that was the Victorians. The darker and grimmer, the better, right?
There was a darkness there. Yeah, absolutely. Which is interesting. It's interesting that they did that. What happened to the ghost stories at Christmas? They we don't do it anymore. It went away.
I think Michelle's still telling them.
All the time. So apparently it's making a comeback. Ghost stories at Christmas. So instead of giving gifts, you would actually exchange a ghost story, and they would have all these macabre, dark-looking cards, and they would try to see who, like they would have little awards for whoever gave the best card that could wig out the recipient the most or something. I'm just like,
yeah,
that's fantastic.
Crazy.
It's supposed to be joyous.
You can find a lot of goth photos and images online. We post them during the holidays. Yeah. I mean, we post them all the month of December during the holiday. Yeah, there's some really creepy Christmas things, and the whole black Christmas tree is not far-fetched. It was used then.
I love picnics in cemeteries.
Well, it is interesting.
But the picnic in the cemetery was to honor their past loved ones, to have them still a part of the present life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the Victorian in the Victorian period, you had these garden cemeteries, these very ornate, elaborate cemeteries that were meant for walking and strolling and stuff like that. Which moved away from like the cramped, the churchyards and things. So yeah, I mean, you certainly saw that even in the landscape architecture of cemeteries and stuff like that in that period. Which is interesting. I also think it's interesting, when it comes to Christmas and stuff like that, it's the darkest time of the year, right?
It is. It's a pagan thing.
It does fit in the kind of the dark stories, and it kind of does fit with the time of year in a way.
It did. I think the church got fed up, and then they agreed. Okay, this is for Halloween. Halloween's going to be okay. We're gonna agree that it's a thing and it's okay. Just stop. Christmas was supposed to be a joyous time, and then try telling the Victorians that. They didn't really go for it. So it's like, but I don't know. I find the movement changed with cinema when Nosferatu, came to be. And I want to tell you a very interesting story that not a lot of people know. And I know this only because Wayne, who's an author of a vampire series, was given this story. Back in World War II, there was a soldier, and he was with a platoon of people, a group, a unit, and they were fighting the Germans, and they had to hunker down somewhere. It was raining. So they ended up on a property, and they went to this farm, and the homeowner said, "You may stay in my barn, but you need to lock the doors, and no matter what you hear, do not open that door. there are things that roam here, and do not open that door because you will go missing. You know, it will end your life.
Wow.
And
Ominous.
when they heard all this commotion outside and scratching and banging along the barn, I mean, the guys were like, they were like terrified. And they looked outside to the crack of a barn, and they could see this figure, this humanoid figure, kind of lurking around outside. And the animals in the barn were just like, you know, like freaking out beside themselves. And allegedly, it turned out to be the man who wrote Nosferatu was one of those people. So always a story that, you know, it was a story that he came across. And I tried to come across it myself and couldn't find it because I thought I could give you the reference. But I thought, wow, because he incorporated that into one of his books that had to do with World War One, actually, I think it was. And he basically incorporated that as his vampire was the guy on the outside of the barn. It was a really weird twist, but I thought, wow, like that goes to show you right there, you know, in Germany, that area, there was this, you know, I mean, he was German, so they would have been obviously against the opposition, but it's like that story.
It's quite the tale.
I know, and Nosferatu,
right?
come on, right?
It's a great experiment too. It's a great experiment too.
You know, people don't realize like that predated Dracula. And I mean, you know, and Baker Stoker is a very good friend of mine. So it's like, unless like, well, yeah, you know, Dracula's still Dracula. I was reading Dracula at 9 years old, you know, but yeah. I think, is that where you think the whole movement changed for I guess being more accepting of vampires and being gravitating towards the allure of the vampire?
Yeah, well, I think it's something that happened over the course of time, where, you know, you start seeing it in the 1800s with literature, where the vampire shifts to be this kind of suave, sophisticated character. The first time you see it is in this in a novella from the early 1800s. It's called The Vampire, and it's written by this guy named Polidori, who was the personal physician to Lord Byron, the famous poet. When The Vampire came out, it was falsely attributed to Byron, so it got very popular. Both Byron and Polidori, you know, tried to set the record straight, but a lot of people got the wrong idea, and so it gained popularity. Yes. But it's about this kind of suave, sophisticated, mysterious nobleman named Lord Ruthven, who kind of befriends this kind of younger fellow, and they travel together. And the younger fellow sees that Lord Ruthven has this kind of destructive effect on the people around him. He's very mysterious, has this allure, and it turns out he is a vampire. A lot of people think that Polidori based Lord Ruthven on Lord Byron because the two men did not get along well. So that kind of set a trajectory. Where you have other Victorian works where you have these vampires who are they're noblemen or what have you, and even in Dracula he's a count, right? Count Dracula.
Yeah.
So they're moving in society in different ways, and then you come to more modern times, 20th century and today, where now you have vampire movies where these vampires are cool or suave or what have you. The thing that I find interesting about a lot of our modern portrayals of vampires is there's often an emphasis on their immortality, right? Yes. There's usually they're young and they're attractive and they'll be that way forever, right? That comes up a lot. In fact, in some movies, you even have humans wanting to become vampires, right? Because they want that immortality. And so I think there's a lot of emphasis on that today. And I think it's kind of speaking to us kind of on a fundamental level, because, when you look at the folklore of the past, right, people were trying to explain things that they didn't understand, right? There were illnesses that were moving through, towns and villages and such. And so, the vampire serves as something that they can focus on. Today, we don't need the vampire for that, right? We understand much more. But science hasn't defeated death yet, right? So we still have this fear of death. So when we see these vampire portrayals today, there's this emphasis on how they have overcome death or sort of sidestepped death. And I think that resonates with people. And at the same time, though, by sort of kind of overcoming death in a way, they're cursed for doing so. Right now, they live in darkness and they have to drink blood and this and that. And I think that also kind of resonates with us too, because there's this message that, well, perhaps the natural course shouldn't be subverted, and there's a price to pay when that's done. So that's kind of, I feel like, how it's sort of, the vampire has evolved and changed over time to meet whatever needs the people need from it.
Yeah,
they show that in the movie Dracula Untold, because then they bring you back to present time, and he's walking about the city streets of New York fine during the daytime. What I wanted to ask you, AP, was when you studied about the immortality, you must have studied the methods of killing off a vampire as well. Did you find that had changed over time from the first time was it the first time though with the spike in the heart? Was that always the first way of killing a vampire?
So there's different approaches in folklore. The stake through the heart, which is, that's a given in modern day. That actually is present in folklore. It comes up a number of times of staking the vampire. What I found interesting, and what I found with a number of things, is that there's often nuance to these things that was present in folklore that's been lost over time. So in like a modern movie or something like that, the hero might have the stake and the vampire lunges at them and they jab the vampire and the vampire turns to dust or something. Kind of climactic. When you look at the folklore surrounding stakes, first of all, we usually say wooden stakes in movies and stuff like that. Wooden stake in the folklore, depending on the place, a certain type of wood was supposed to be used. So it might be it might be hot, depending on the place, hawthorn, blackthorn, oak, aspen. One of the potential explanations for why the type of wood mattered was that there were beliefs that wood was associated to the crucifixion. So, this was the wood that was used for the crown of thorns or used for the cross or something like that. So that probably imbued the wood with some kind of spiritual power. The other thing, in some accounts, it uses some particular language when it describes staking the vampire. And it'll say that a stake was driven through the corpse, pinning it to the ground. So what really was going on with that was that they were driving the stake through the body into the earth beneath it, such that the vampire wouldn't be able to sit up and get out of its grave. Mm-hmm. So you had kind of, there was like pinning them down. You're pinning them into the ground, so they couldn't get out. So there was kind of like a practical view to it. So you have this wood, which is kind of, there's this spiritual thing, there's this practical piece, and oftentimes, through the heart, was a thing. I think destruction of the heart also plays a role in there, because there were some beliefs that involved removing the heart and burning it, that kind of thing. And the heart's an organ associated with life and blood and that kind of thing. So I think there was.
It's great when they would feed you the ash as a protection against evil.
Yes, they that
was
do
like
that.
A little weird. Yeah.
Number of accounts where they would take out the heart and they would burn it to ashes. They would mix those ashes with water and give it to the afflicted, and it was believed that would cure the person, and the person would then be saved.
Oh my gosh!
I know the macabre things that they used to do to one another.
That I never knew.
Yeah, it's quite surprising. You don't see it in movies and stuff like that today. Obviously, it's
no.
For the
they
general
should
audience.
Put that in though.
It's quite striking. And I mean, the interesting thing about that is that belief pops up in some different places. There are accounts from it in Romania, but it actually also occurred in America, in New England, in the late 1800s. So that belief traveled, halfway around the world, to arrive in the U.S., which is also very interesting. So again, depending on the place and time, cutting off the head or something like that. Some people would just flip the body over, so the vampire would dig its way down into the earth instead of up.
Oh gosh!
It would give the vampire much credit.
If it was only that simple.
It was only that simple. One I really liked, which is one approach I liked, because it seems like something I would come up with, because I can be lazy, is they would take essentially a stake. It was like a distaff, which is used for spinning yarn. But they would take it and they drive it into the ground above the grave. So if the vampire tried to get out, it would stake itself.
So that's a lazy man's way of
seen
staking
that
the
on
vampire.
Supernatural. I think I've seen that on one of the episodes of Supernatural that they tried that or something. I've seen that before. I think so. I don't know if it was that show, but yeah, so, like it just as soon as you said it, I saw it. Oh my gosh, that is hilarious. Vampire.
Yeah,
I would love it that way. Can you imagine if we could do that
where you
with
just
demons?
make them dig to China, be going all week just trying to get out. I know.
Or to Hollow Earth.
Hollow Earth, it could be too.
Hollow Earth. And then that could be where they're all living still now. If
they're all there.
Flip them over.
All there.
Have you ever come
I don't
across
doubt anything.
A specific case that to you was compelling? For me, it was the story of Count Saint Germain. That to me was the most compelling. That's the only one that actually made me go, that could be.
Saint Germain, he was believed to have made like an amulet of immortality, right? And
he was an alchemist, right?
Yeah, he was an alchemist. Yeah. I've read a bit about him, but I'm not super plugged in. But in terms of accounts, I mean, there's many accounts that are interesting. When you get into the ones that are more well documented, that were a bit more modern, say in newspapers and stuff like that. It can be pretty. It's like, okay, it seems like there were misinterpretations of what's going on. Mm-hmm. As you get further into the past, sometimes the stories get there's a lot of quite like extraordinary details when you go back to like early accounts.
Sure.
So it's hard to know.
The fish was this big and ended up being
exactly
this
right.
big. Like with Saint Germain, he was said to be born in 1690, but people are like, no, he was around during the crucifixion, and it's just like, well, that's a big jump, man.
That's a big gap, honey.
It is a big gap. But I think as they started coming into this, the 1700s, everything was documented with him, like pretty specifically. He belonged to all these secret societies, and they had documented that stuff. And then all of a sudden, he shows up in like New Orleans, and even give his address. And I'm thinking,
oh, that's right. Yeah, there's like a building where he supposedly lived in New Orleans.
It was. He lived at a place where I'll have to ask Joe about this. He'll know where it is. It's in New Orleans because we broadcast in New Orleans. But he lived at 1041 Royal Street. And at the time, and then we're talking like that would be about 1902. And he went by the name Jacques Saint Germain. Like he had some different aliases and stuff. And all of a sudden those guys would just like disappear. And then he'd be quiet for like, 100 years. And I think the last report of him was in like the 1970s.
Wow. And so do you think? So you think he's still around?
I don't know.
You never know.
Joe will tell you there's all kinds of vampires around New Orleans because I don't know, man. I've seen stuff where, you just see somebody, and it's questionable. You just see things going on, and I guess it comes down to again that being in the area that is so active with the belief. Because New Orleans it's one of those places of wonder that a lot of people, migrated to. And it's got a whole mix of different cultures and belief systems and religions and vampires. It's like, that's a real big one. You ask people throughout New Orleans, there's a whole movement, even like you say, in modern time, people who just live the lifestyle.
That's true. Yeah, there are certainly people that live a lifestyle, or they believe that they need to have consume some small amounts of blood from willing participants and stuff like that. That was not a focus for my research, so I haven't talked to people in those groups, so I can't really speak with authority on it. But I certainly would run across that from time to time. That there certainly are people out there that are engaged with these vampire beliefs in some fashion.
Yeah, I guess it's just
secret societies.
Yeah, well, I think it just sort of goes back to, to the fact that people really are. Is it just a mindset thing, or is it a real physical need? Power of suggestion, like it gets really funky. So what's the oldest account? Like when you started getting to the ancient stuff, what was the oldest piece of literature that you had that you could trace back?
Well, it's interesting because it first of all, like it depends on how you want to define a vampire in terms of how far back it goes, right? That's always like the kind of gotcha with this thing.
Yeah.
And that's something I learned like kind of like early into my research. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Well, I got to figure out what I want to deem to be a vampire for this, because otherwise I'm going to be pulled in a lot of different directions. Because when you start researching mythology and legends and stuff like that, they'll be like, oh, there was a monster and it lived in the forest, and anyone who wandered in it would drink their blood.
4,000 years in the past,
right? And you might
might be
in the past. People will often bring up, the legend of Lilith, and from the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
And so I kind of had to figure out, I'm like, all right, well, for the purposes of my book, my research, what am I going to deem to be a vampire, right? And so for me, I came up with 3 criteria that something would have to meet for me to say, okay, I'm going to include this as a vampire. The first criteria was that it was the corpse of a once living person. So it was someone who was alive at one point and now they're dead. So by making that, by sort of defining that, I exclude like monsters and demons, and entities that were never human to begin with, right? Because there's accounts of monsters and stuff like that.
You're pulling the myth away, basically, for the most part.
And that was kind of my thing. It was like, let's because that's certainly an interesting thing to research, but that to me that was different than what I was going for.
Right.
Or it also discounts like witches who are still alive, right? Like these they're the evil spellcasters, let's say.
Right.
Because they so it had to be someone who was once alive and now they're dead. The second criteria was that it had to be harming the living in some way. So I actually broadened it out a little bit from just the pure blood drinking, which does come up in accounts, but sometimes in those accounts the vampires are doing other things. There are other accounts that don't mention blood drinking. But to me, if I only talked about accounts that had blood drinking, I would miss a lot of relevant stuff. Because I think it was, to me, the fear of the dead and the dead causing harm in some fashion was important for this. And then lastly, it was that to destroy the vampire, action had to be taken against the corpse itself. So there's a physicality to vampires that is, I think, different than like a ghost or a spirit, like something that's more ethereal or untethered or something like that. With the vampire accounts, there's a physical problem. It's in the ground somewhere in the graveyard, and people are going to take action against it, and that's the solution.
Right.
So that to me, those criteria, the physicality and the once living now dead, that kind of thing, those were my criteria. That I'm like, okay, if it meets those things more or less, I want to include it. And I might diverge if I think there's something relevant to say. But that allowed me to hone in on these stories. That I thought were kind of important for stripping away the modern vampire and exposing the folkloric vampire. So with that in mind, some of the oldest tales I encountered, like for example, right, like in the Odyssey, right, which is this class, from the classical period. There's a scene where Odysseus, he goes to like the entry to Hades or the underworld, and he digs a trench and he fills it with the blood of animals, and then all these wraiths from the underworld come out and try to drink the blood, and the ones that he lets drink the blood are able to speak to him, right? So like right there you have like, well, is that like a vampire? Like it kind of fits in. Oh, is that like a vampire account? Well, it's sort of close, but to me, well, those are more ghosts that are drinking, because they were in the underworld. They weren't necessarily buried in like a community, but it's there, right? There's stuff there that you can see the evolution of thought.
It's a little bit like the Tale of the Highgate vampire in the UK.
60s, late 60s.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, do you think that's relatively recent? Where you have a group of occultists basically who dig up a corpse, and they basically stake it and they do some ceremony. And right after that, there was said to be a tall figure of a man dressed in gray.
Yeah, looming around the cemetery.
Yeah, and he'd be floating above it, which never happened before they did that. So what do you make of that? That's a bit
so
kind
it's
of like what you're talking about, the Odyssey.
yeah, and it's
Ghosts
interesting
or
you bring up Highgate, which is in Great Britain, and one of the earliest accounts that I found was from the 12th century in Great Britain, from a chronicler there who has this account of this man who torments this village. And I will also point out that the term vampire was used in certain places and certain times. I did not limit myself to only stories that actually said this was a vampire. There's lots of different names for these kinds of entities.
There are,
so the terminology,
again, depending on the part of the world you're at too,
exactly.
right?
There's all exactly. So that's it. And I in the book I'll mention like, it was the actual names used at times because I found it interesting. And the Highgate account is Highgate Cemetery itself is quite the cemetery. I visited it. I don't know, maybe a couple years ago. It's a beautiful cemetery, and it's actually linked. It's got a few different kind of vampire talking points. Obviously, there was the actual Highgate vampire account from like it was like late 60s, I think in 1970, something like that, which happened, which unfortunately kind of ended with a lot of people kind of storming the cemetery on a vampire hunt, and there was a lot of
it did, and it became a big movie mecca location, and it just got really stupid, right?
Yeah, and so it was
70s,
So it was used for like at least one of the Hammer vampire movies.
Yes.
They shot some of it there, which is, and it totally fits. Like it's a beautiful cemetery. And also some people wonder if it was the inspiration for a scene in Bram Stoker's novel Dracula where Lucy's buried. Some people think Stoker was basing that cemetery on Highgate potentially. So it's got a few different vampire talking points.
Yeah, I mean, I could always connect you up with Dacre if you ever want to delve into, some of that extra stuff, because he's got all of Bram's notes.
Oh wow!
It was his great grand uncle.
Yeah,
so
I've certainly kind of read about him from time to time. He
he's really well versed. If you wanted to get into that whole thing, it's pretty wild. But
the literary aspect.
Considering the man never stepped foot in Romania, he's just described it so accurately, and leaves you wondering. It's just like brilliance.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He did a lot. Yeah, he did. As I understand it, did a lot of research for it. I actually got to see some of the notes, some of his handwritten notes, in Philadelphia. They were on display at a museum there, and it was really it was quite striking to see it. That you think he's writing this book, he's trying to put something out there, and he hopes it's going to be successful, and the impact that book had on popular culture, and still to this day. I mean, it's like you can't overstate the impact that Bram Stoker had.
No, because he's written other books.
No.
Why this one?
It keyed right into something, and it's still impacting us today. Oh yeah,
it is. It was a masterpiece. It was a whole other, like you say, pop culture. It was like a whole. I always think like Rocky Horror Picture Show. It had a complete there's a whole.
It still has a cult following.
Yeah, it's just like a whole following built around it, and that essentially is Dracula, and so much has been modeled after it, and it was just so far removed from Vlad Dracula, obviously, but but still, like, people actually believe they're one of the same. Still,
yeah. I mean, those that comes up quite a bit. I mean, there was a BBC Netflix production, was like last year or something like that. Dracula. It was a three-part miniseries.
Yeah.
So it's still being like redone and reinterpreted today. So I mean,
it's nice to see though.
Yeah,
I'm glad to see that it's still going, because it was my favorite book of all time. Like I'm grateful that I've got an original first edition of like one of the very first. I'm just like
the yellow cover and the red text there.
It's just like, I'm fortunate, but it's like I've used to buy up tons and tons of different ones just because I was a collector. But from a really young age. So it's weird how it just starts for some people like yourself so young. It just, where does that come from?
It resonates. I don't know. Yeah, it just resonates. Like, what? What is
we
this?
Just weirdos? Like, what is it? Like,
to me, that's where you bring in past lives.
Well, yeah, because I mean, most kids are.
Did you live in that era? Did you, like if you're a believer in past lives, then one would start to think, did I live in that era? Did I live in those times? Does that resonate with me because I remember the stories, or did you have an experience that made you feel that way? So that can sit with you.
That's interesting. Maybe there's like an awareness there, and thus you're drawn to like the supernatural, the paranormal, because there's something more to things because of that.
You lived it. I have those real serious aha moments in my life every day, and I really believe that you can connect them with other things, especially if you're a believer in former lives and past lives. You're going to. It's going to excite you when you start writing it down and go, oh my God, why do some people collect antiques all their lives? Why does Michelle surround herself with all of these medieval pieces?
Yeah, from all over the world.
There's a reason for all of it. Yes.
Yeah, because it's a reminder for me, and it basically gives me comfort. But
and
to have an interest for such a young age in something like vampires, like, I don't know. I mean, I wanted books back then that spoke about Prince Vlad, not just Dracula. I just, even at the age of 12, I needed to know and understand the connection. Like you took that. I read about it, but you come out and you did it. You've branched it, you've merged them together and wrote a book about it. So, I wasn't the only one. I'm a weird ass little kid. It's just like my father would look at my mother and say, "What's wrong with her?" My mother's like, she's just going through something. It's just weird.
Yeah.
Like,
oh my
Normally
goodness.
at 12, you're still playing with Barbies, maybe. Well, not nowadays. Yeah. Nowadays, I don't know what they're playing with, but I don't want to know. But I mean, when I was 12, you were still a child, really, to think of Vlad or to focus on ghosts.
Just connecting the dots, much like what AP has done.
Yeah.
Just connect the dots. Like what was the driving force? What made somebody want to write about and glorify, really, this being that culture or ancient culture was terrified of?
Yeah, it's hard to know how people interpret the world around them through their own beliefs, and then kind of what sort of new things arise from it. But yeah, it's strange to think why some people are drawn to certain things and not others. And the past life is always fascinating. And of course, there's people that do the past life regression and stuff like that, which is a whole other thing, which is very interesting. But yeah, of course, if there was a vampire around, they would have been around the whole time. So
that's true.
Maybe they would meet the same person over and over again.
Yeah,
you never know. They say that if you have a fear of fires or drowning, it comes from a past life. They have those beliefs as well. So that's why I said whenever there's a connection to something from way, way back, I always believe that it's because we lived it in one way or another.
And so you carry that bit with you. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Always. Zachman had said earlier, I don't know how it fits now, but one interpretation of vampires that he found interesting was in the novel I Am Legend. Vampirism was caused by a worldwide pandemic. Just a little creepy right now to point that out, Zach. That birthed two types. That birthed two types. One that were like humans and the other being the undead. So I didn't watch the film nor read the book, so I don't know.
So I think that's an interesting kind of further development with vampires that we get kind of in more modern things, where when you look at old sort of older stuff, right? It's the vampires is sort of supernatural, right? There's a magical kind of connotation in some fashion, right? Something paranormal. where now you'll have different shows or movies, what have you, where there's a scientific explanation for vampirism, right? Where it's caused by a virus or something like that. So that's sort of a new direction, a new evolution of vampires that's being taken, because I think, maybe the paranormal stuff doesn't necessarily resonate with everybody these days. They want something that's more science fiction or seems more plausible or something like that. So I wonder if that will sort of take momentum in the future, where you'll have more of those kinds of vampires, where you don't worry about like the cross and stuff, or the holy water or stuff like that.
Well, walking in daylight, eating normal food, even just not being able to
eating. Period. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd like to see it go back to the basics of not being so glamorous. Do you ever remember watching a TV series called The Strain? And it was the Strigoi.
The Strain. That was that.
And he looked like a Nosferatu type, like not pretty at all. And it was almost like a Blade sort of creature, with the big ear, the bad ears, and bald, and then they're just.
Oh yeah, it had the mouth thing that.
Well, that was Blade, but you know what? The Strain, and again, because of, I guess it went back to that part of the world, they were called Strigoi, and they were being hunted, and it was just all these crazy teeth and things, and it was just like,
I've never seen that.
Was that the Del Toro one? Was that Del Toro did that one?
I don't know if he did that series or not. I can't remember. It was probably about 4 years ago, and I just remember seeing it and going, see, that's something that is truly terrifying to see, because, when you're digging somebody up out of a hole that's been there for a while, they're not going to be pretty. Like,
you think,
go get your little fix, and all of a sudden you're looking beautiful and glamorous. No, no.
I mean, and that's when people dug them up, they did. Well, it's funny because I think people would be surprised. People would be surprised by some of this even today, because when you think of someone, decomposing or whatever, I think normally you think of someone's turning into a skeleton. So if you're going to see them, they're going to be somewhere on their way towards skeleton. So they're going to get thinner and fall apart. But that may not actually it may not happen that way. So when people would dig up bodies, the person might seem as if they hadn't decayed at all. So they might seem like they had an unnatural vitality. So that would be evidence to these people that, okay, they're stealing the life. They're stealing this life force from the living to preserve their own kind of unnatural, undead life.
In Eastern Europe, yes. But there's some other parts of the world, they really dig these creepy looking things.
When did embalming come into play in history? When was embalming in play? Because I would imagine that would stop one from being a vampire.
Yeah, I think
to take a look at modern time vampires. How is that possible with all the embalming that we do?
I think embalming became popular in the U.S. during the Civil War. I think
Stop vampires. Did you not see Abe Lincoln, the Vampire Hunter?
I didn't see that.
No, I didn't.
Really good. Taking care of those vampires.
See, right?
So, and so the thing is, with some other kind of some of these kind of like things they would see when they dig these people up, is the person might actually look like they had gained weight. They might actually look like they were like bloated and red in the face and stuff like that. So they might actually look like fuller and healthier than they did when they were alive.
Not like Nosferatu.
Not like Nosferatu. So if
a lot more like Edward Cullen.
Poser.
So if they would dig up, in some of these stories, if they would dig up a corpse that looked kind of like withered and moving towards a skeleton, they'd move on, because like, oh no, that's what it's supposed to be. That's fine. That's what we're expecting. It's these other things that were like, oh, that's we shouldn't be seeing this. This person's alive. They're bloated because they've been drinking people's blood, and something must be done. And I cannot see that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean,
I think if anything, Twilight made me Team Jacob. Twilight had that effect on me that I'm in the paranormal, and this is really so far-fetched. But anyways,
oh,
was a teenager's
But
teenagers romance,
I
right?
love, oh, the moms were worse. I think the moms were worse. But I like people's, I do like to see different perspectives. Even that one, it was still a perspective, where people, she had an idea, and it was just again, these beautiful people not really
Oh yeah.
really grasping, like what these things really are, what they represent,
And I think that's the power. That's sort of the power of the vampire in the way is that and that's why we still have vampires around. I think in our kind of modern culture is that they've adapted and they've changed over time.
Mhm.
So it's you wonder 100 years from now will people be like, oh, Twilight? If it wasn't for Twilight, we wouldn't still be talking about
We would be all
vampires.
messed up and
Uh,
thinking they sparkle and
yeah. So
stuff.
it's hard to know. I mean,
That's geared to teenagers. Yeah.
I mean, the shift happened in the 19th century literature where you had these suave vampires. They took it in a new direction, and it kind of just kept going in new directions, which I think is okay. I think
Mhm.
people interpret it to meet whatever needs that they're looking for to make a good story and have something that resonates with audiences. But it certainly has changed quite a bit from where it started. It's not when people see movies and they think, oh, well, this is what people believed about vampires. You can't go off of movies for that. It's not going to give you the actual like folkloric picture.
Mhm. It was nice
For
to
me, it was
see.
Bela Lugosi. It
Oh,
wasn't. That
it
was
was.
my first. You want to laugh? My first time I ever saw Dracula, and I'll never forget it, is with those two comedians, Laurel and Hardy. Not
Laurel and
Laurel and
Hardy.
Hardy. Oh my God, Abbott and Costello.
Abbott and Costello
Abbott
meet
and
Dracula.
Costello. Yes, that's like one of my first recollections of I was always intrigued by vampires and Dracula because I grew up with the tuxedo Dracula.
Sure. Oh yeah. I mean,
The
that's.
romantic, the suave, the charmer.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
Halloween vampire. Everyone's used to that.
Yeah.
If you see any kind of like generic Halloween sign decorations or whatever, that's the vampire you're gonna get. You're gonna get the big collar,
Mhm.
and the
The
tuxedo and all that stuff.
stereotypical. Yeah, I like that they remade Nosferatu as a series 2 years ago,
Oh,
and
I
he
don't
was
know if
some.
I've seen it.
Yeah, it was Nosferatu. It was just spelled where it was like a license plate. You know how it's just sort of like a
Oh,
mismatch
cool.
mishmash of letters, and I'm going, Nosferatu. I need a plate like that. It's genius. But it's like, wow, something that you could, like not everybody, police are following you. They just, what was that? You don't want the obvious, but no kidding. But it's just it was nice to see that made because again, it's a twist, and it was based on a different type, of vampire altogether. Like people say, well, one spun off of the other, Dracula and Nosferatu, but I mean, they're both much, much different. But, now I'm just a fan of, what they do in the shadow. So Nandor has become my favorite now. I love Nandor. And Peter's like the Nosferatu one. So of course that's the series, like the New Zealand version is a little bit darker, but it's just I don't know. I love to see that it's still going on and people are still like they're just tunnel vision when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, it's great, and I like that they do comedies with it. What We Do in the Shadows. I love the movie.
I love the movie too.
I need to watch the series. It's on my watch list.
Oh,
I'm
you'll
I'm
love it.
excited to watch it because it's from the scenes I've seen of it. It looks fantastic. I like the comedies. It's fun. It's fun to sort of take this character, this entity that we're so familiar with from different movies and stuff like that, and have some fun with it. And that's
Mhm.
great.
It is.
Sesame
It
Street
is.
did it. Sesame Street did it
Yes.
impeccably.
No, but
So
you know what? With Sesame Street, and correct me if I'm wrong, AP, that comes back to with the counting, from an
Yeah,
old tradition that how to
Dracula.
distract a vampire is to throw rice or something on the ground that they have to start counting to distract them.
That is true, and I actually do talk about that in the book.
Good.
I
did that in Supernatural too.
So that's there you go.
I've only seen that series 100 times, but I think because to me it's comedic, it's lifting. But anyways,
I mean it's I've seen a couple episodes of it. My wife's seen quite a bit of it. So
where did this tradition come from? What was it? Which culture was it born from?
So that's it. So the counting comes up in a couple different from a couple different cultures. So you're right. The Count in Sesame Street, who I think probably might be the first kind of vampire a lot of people are exposed to. Because he's in a children's program. And I think most people think the counting is just kind of a pun, right? It's just a play on his name, right? His name's the Count Von Count, and he counts like, oh yeah, that's cute. I have no idea if the creators of the character knew that this was a thing in actual folklore. But there's a variety of beliefs where the vampire was thought it would obsessively count things. So they would take rice or grain or something like that. They might put it in the coffin or sprinkle it around, and the vampire would have to count every grain, and so that would occupy them throughout the night. There were some beliefs where actually it would take them. They would count like one a year or something like that, so it'd be even longer.
So you didn't have to kill them. You could just like fill them up with rice or grain.
Right. So that was the thing people would do to prevent the vampire coming back. Is like, if they were suspicious about somebody, you could put grain in. You might do a number of things, but one thing is you'd throw some grain in there or rice or something like that, and that would distract them. The origins, like where that belief came from, I did a little bit of digging on that. Because I was wondering, like, where does this come from? That they were,
because it's some weird, crazy.
It's very specific, and it's not something you would think someone would just kind of like add to the tale or make up. Like, why would this be there?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't necessarily gain an answer with 100% sort of certainty, but what I did find, which could kind of somewhat explain it. So there was this belief in sort of, and vampires are also thought to maybe untie knots as well. You might throw a net in there with them obsessively untie knots.
I didn't know about that one. That's good.
So
that's genius.
So this
silly
belief,
string.
this compulsion was also existed in folklore surrounding like witches, like malevolent witches. They were also thought to sort of obsessively like count things or whatever.
I was gonna say that, and shiny things would distract them, almost like a crow. It was just
So like they would sort of focus in on things, right? So like there was a belief where you would hang like a piece of like a tree outside your door, and the witch would like count all the leaves or something like that, and thus wouldn't be able to come inside. So I wonder if the belief may have started with witches and moved on to vampires, because there's a lot of overlap between witches and vampires in folklore. And the other interesting thing that I think might speak to some of the genesis of it was that there was a belief that complex patterns, like in a Celtic cross, let's say, would distract the evil eye. Right. Mm-hmm. So like witches might have like the evil eye, so they might, cast their gaze on you. But if you had something like complicated to look at, that would distract the evil eye and break its power. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if it was sort of an evolution of this, where like, okay, well, the evil eye is going to be distracted by this complex looking thing. Oh, they must be obsessed with complexity, and thus it sort of evolved into counting, and then might have made the jump to vampires, because there were beliefs where people who were witches in life or practice black magic in life would become vampires in death. Mm-hmm. Even the term strigoi, like that could actually mean a living person who was a witch or a dead one who then was coming back. And sometimes like the dead ones would teach spells to the living ones and stuff like that. So like strigoi was like a kind of like a life cycle. The vampire was just sort of part of their overall life cycle. So I think that the counting with vampires might have sort of evolved possibly from these beliefs regarding witchcraft, which might have come from these notions of like the evil, distracting them from the evil eye. Am I 100% certain on that? I can't say that with 100% certainty.
That's a great theory, though.
It seems like it might have evolved that way.
Yeah, it could fit. I just wanted to quickly For those of you that are just tuning in, you are listening to The Outer Realm with Michelle Desrochers and Amelia Pisano with our special guest, A.P. Sylvia. You're tuned in to 107.7 FM New Orleans on United Paranormal Radio, Public Radio Network. I almost gave him the other one. We have two. And it is partially sponsored and brought to you by Folgers Coffee. Thank you, Folgers. I do have a question in here because we're going to pass this completely. Is it okay if I ask?
Mm-hmm.
Is it okay if I bring it up? Okay, Jonathan Silva writes, "Hi, AP. Do you think there are any modern day vampires hiding in certain parts of the world?"
From the research I've done, I'm not convinced that actual corpses are kind of clawing their way out of the ground. But certainly in certain places, people do still believe that. And you know what? It's a big world out there. So never say never, right?
Yeah, you got Count Saint Germain, the alchemist who discovered the key to the Philosopher's Stone and somehow immortality.
Why doesn't he share it? He should post it online or something.
I know. It's
I'll have the magic. Make gold and whatnot, right?
Bloody crazy.
Turn lead to gold.
But maybe he's doing it for Hollow Earth. I have this Hollow Earth thing in my head, but maybe he's doing it. Yeah, because I just started researching and it's driving me crazy because it's so compelling. But anyways, you never know. I'm always thinking maybe these societies of vampires are in there. Maybe they're, maybe Saint Germain is there somewhere. Who knows?
Well, if you follow the theory, do you put any merit into the theory that maybe these things are a race of extraterrestrials? So, I mean, we don't really know what's out there, right?
So the extraterrestrial link is interesting. It's something I've mused on a little bit. Maybe not quite the link you're referring to, but in some of these vampire accounts, some of them, the descriptions are like, this person is waking up in the middle of the night. The vampire is in their room. The vampire is on top of them, so they can't move. They feel this immense weight of the undead person on them. The dead person strangling
much like
them.
The hag syndrome.
So they can't. Exactly. Right. Yeah. So with some of these things, you see this. It sounds like the old hag syndrome. What science would refer to as sleep paralysis.
Yeah.
It also parallels beliefs regarding like the incubus or the succubus, right? Demons and all that. But then you also look at some modern day alien encounters experiences where some where people are they're in their room, they can't move, they feel there's a presence in the room that is preventing them from moving, they can't speak. So you see these interesting parallels there between all these different kind of spiritual, these sort of supernatural experiences or or anomalous experiences. So it fits in there. So I think it becomes a matter of interpretation, right? Of sort of how people are experiencing something, and it's how their worldview in terms of how they're experiencing it. Where nowadays we have this notion of science and space travel and aliens and stuff like that. Hundreds of years ago they wouldn't have thought of that. They wouldn't have recognized that, right? They wouldn't have thought of space aliens. They would have thought of demons or monsters or the undead or something like that.
A more simplistic way of thinking.
Right, because it fit into their spiritual worldview in that way.
See, for me, I think portals, and again, I'll use Romania as an example, being in the haunted forest. It's just one of many, many, portals that are said to actually exist under a no-fly zone, said to be, like they always see crafts over the mountain. The locals now, camera phones, anybody could just capture everything. It's not like you can really keep it hidden, but it's just, you think that some of these locations are the dawn of where these bits of folklore came from. So is it possible, are there a race of beings that were here long before us, let's say, that come in and out of these portals or sacred places, power spots throughout the world, stargates that are said to be around? It's just a theory. I wonder if you had given any thought to that sort of thing.
I mean, I certainly, I've heard of these kinds of theories with, in relation to lots of like Mothman and stuff like that,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
these window areas where is it some kind of being from a parallel universe or
Yeah.
something like that,
Interdimensional beings, yeah.
interdimensional, right? Like, which is quite fast. I mean, quite
It
fascinating.
is. It's another
Um,
twist.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the thing with the vampires is then just like, well, where do you want to take? Because the vampires, they're people that are known to the community but have passed away. So then it's like a question of like, well, let's say hypothetically, if the vampire is from sort of this parallel, this parallel universe or an
Maybe
alternate
he
dimension.
made that one. Maybe it was one of these other more evolved beings that created the neighbor, let's say.
So you think that? So you
Oh
think
my
maybe
God.
an evolved being made the vampire being?
Well, what I'm saying is, let's say they were an extraterrestrial race of beings who, you know, feed on the life force of others.
So,
Not even necessarily. We look at life force as blood, but maybe let's just go with life force. And I
sure.
think there have been some movies that have even captured that part of it. So if that's a thing, we're dealing with energy. So, can they go into, let's say, a modern day human, because they would just look like, you know, you and I sort of thing, especially if they're said to shapeshift.
Right. So could they take on the form of someone that was known,
Curiosity.
or is it that
Or
they have no
turn them.
physical form and they have to inhabit the body
There
because
we
that's
go.
how the only way they can interact with our
Possession.
world? Yes.
Demon.
All comes back to demons, I'm telling you.
I'm just
Demons or
going
ETs.
around
You
in
got
it,
one or the other.
I bring it up because there's just been a lot of people like through the years, in just doing paranormal research, and of course vampires come up like any other sort of mythical being of sorts. And this is just something that I've heard come up a few times, and I went, why not? It's just feasible as
You never know.
as a lot of the old myths, I guess. Like folklore
It's
starts
really
with
hard to
something.
do what Michelle does and then say that's not possible, because what you see and what you do is impossible to so many, right? So yeah, there's huge possibilities. But I always say it comes back down to demons, ET, and then that fine line of what's what.
What's in the middle?
It's
Or are
interesting.
they one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of interpretation, right? What one person or society might term a demon,
absolutely.
others would call an extraterrestrial, perhaps.
Vampires can be a race of our level of demons, or can be a race of ETs. I mean, if you want to get into it, you can go for hours with that one.
I just
It all
find it
depends on the
fascinating.
person's perspective.
It's just because you have people from going back to ancient times who have never connected certain parts of the world, that there's no way they would connect. They just didn't have the means to travel, I think, to that degree, and yet everything is just so similar with stories and like right down to traits, they all seem to know how to, take one out, kill one, incapacitate it, whatever you want to call it. It's just, that's the part I find the most fascinating. So you have to have something that's pretty much globally pretty darn similar.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's fascinating that different places have come up with this similar kind of thing. Was it stories that somehow made their way over the course of time? Is it something more innate in people? Is it like kind of a Jungian thing? The collective unconscious, or is there some kind of phenomena or experience like the old hag syndrome we talked about that's shared among people, and thus that it's a shared experience among various places, and thus that is the interpretation that is the that's their view of it. So it's interesting stuff. You don't it's hard to know. It's hard to know, and it's the world. There's so many mysteries. The world's full of mysteries, and you wonder, is it being interpreted? How is it being interpreted? How are people, because they're going to see it through what their realm of experience, right? If you understand what a plane is, what a plane. If you've never seen a plane before, then you're going to think it's something else, right? That fits into your worldview.
That's a great point.
That's true. Oh, it's true. So in your research, what's what's your theory on it? What is your final, or are you planning on writing another book? Because you're like, I don't know.
There's so much information still coming out of you, so that's why.
I know. I know.
I mean, for me, the goal of my book and my work was to sort of strip away our modern notions about vampires, our kind of misconceptions about the actual beliefs of the past. So so my thing was to kind of get at what the true beliefs were, and kind of share that, and really bring forth the folkloric vampire that's been forgotten. And in some of that, I explore some of the misinterpretations about disease and decomposition and things like that. But ultimately, my real interest is just, what do people believe? What are the kinds of beliefs out there? And I don't necessarily have to come up with an answer or an explanation to say this is what it was or something like that. If there's interesting theories, I'll share them. But for me, I'm more interested in just what did people believe? And I'm just sort of interested by that, and I like to reflect on that and kind of just share it.
It would, you should almost consider just writing a book about people who've had potential encounters. I don't really know that. There's a lot online, but there's nothing like really modern. Everything is sort of like you say, it goes so far back. It's like, is it just something they were perceiving? Is it just something like, porphyria, like that type of a disease, which brings in everything, like garlic and the sensitivity to sunlight and
the garlic makes me laugh the hardest, though.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's just like, you have a lot of old perceptions and old mindsets and belief systems, but modern times we are more open-minded because of television, the internet. You can let your imagination go pretty crazy for sure. But wouldn't it just be interesting to see if people, were having some kind of an experiences and can come forward in a sort of logical.
Yeah, it's interesting. People certainly are still having, anomalous experiences, right? Where they're experiencing, waking up in the middle of the night and feeling something holding them down, let's say, seeing things that, kind of defy, defy description and stuff like that. I think it becomes a matter of interpretation. There are some people who experience sleep paralysis who they think it's like they see like a vampire or something like that. But it's in those kinds of things, it's kind of the assumption is, well, that's the dream state that is just being superimposed onto reality, right? So it's a question of, what are people seeing and feeling, and then what do they believe they are seeing and feeling, and how are they interpreting that? Or do they believe this is something supernatural going on, whatever it is, or do they believe that there's some kind of other, there's some other explanation for it or something like that? And so I think that's part of it, because everyone's unique. So I think they're going to take, especially nowadays where you're not locked into like one worldview about things, right? Like if you go back hundreds of years and you lived in a village and that's the only place you ever lived, you probably had a pretty strict like kind of frame of reference for how you interpreted the world. And it was probably, viewed through your religious beliefs and, the folklore that had been passed down to you. Nowadays there's so much, as you said, available to you on television, the internet. There's so many different ways you could interpret something. And arrive at something. Well, I think it was this, and somebody else might have a similar experience, but no, I think it was this. And there's a richness there because of that. But at the same time, it's harder to put it into any one box.
No, it's true. It's true. It's just one of those. It's one of those things. Like, I'm sure there's the same argument when it comes to werewolves, or because there are many sightings. The Beast of Bray Road. We've got something similar, in Canada. There's, here they'll be called like wolf people or wolves that walk upright, or there's sightings of these things. So it kind of, like you say, it's kind of like that counterpart to the vampire. So if there's so many sightings that are going on of this being, why not, a human version of this mystical, being that causes so much enchantment with the female folk. Yes. I mean, I think, being like New Orleans, I think you have, Anne Rice's version of the vampire Lestat.
Of course.
I mean, everybody just loves
Love
the
her.
vampire Lestat. Yeah, there's the vampire ball that goes on, every year. People really get into it. You go to, you could have, vampire ball in Romania. Like they have them all over the place. It's just something about it that just draws us in from the time
I've yet to
we're
get
a child.
An invitation.
I know, time we're a weird ass little kid to even now, as we sit here talking about it, we're still left here kind of scratching our head. And it's just, I sometimes wonder, am I more fascinated by the human perception and how we're drawn in more so than the whole component of it,
Oh yeah, I mean, because well, everyone has to view the world through their eyes and their interpretation, right? Like what there's sort of what's actually going on, and there's what you think is going on. It's fascinating how people will have these different kind of viewpoints on, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that, and I think that's fun. I think it's fun to kind of be like, you hear about some kind of anomalous paranormal thing or something like that, and then there's like, well, it could be, there's a more mundane explanation, but then there's, well, it could be this other thing, or it could be this other thing, and it's
we don't want to hear the mundane explanation. We really want to think that there's a vampire.
It's certainly more, it's certainly more fun.
Like the Salem's Lot thing, your creepy neighbor.
Yeah, I know, it's in the basement, right? It's just
sorry, cemetery. Never mind. Oh no, it's okay. There's a question. Zachman has a question. Vampires are stereotypically known for drinking blood. Do legends about them explain their necessity to consume bodily fluids / energy? Would it be considered an addiction, and is it possible for vampires to fully function without having to consume blood?
Yeah, so the blood drinking certainly is present in folklore, though there's other accounts where blood drinking maybe isn't mentioned or isn't a major component. There might just be, they're causing illness or stealing life, causing illness and death, or stealing life in a bit more of not as a tactile, not in more of a tactile way. In terms of the blood drinking, blood has ancient associations to life and life force, right? So that, I think people would look at that and go, okay, well, they're taking the blood of the living such that they can sustain themselves in death. Also, interestingly, in some of these accounts, when people would dig up the corpse, when they would look at the corpse, there would be what they took to be blood around the mouth. In fact, there's like one account where the vampire was strangling people and killing people and causing this illness, and it doesn't mention blood drinking until they dig up the corpse. They see the blood around the mouth. They go, "That's the blood that he's been drinking from the victims." And this actually that actually could happen in decomposition process. Fluids can actually come out of the mouth. So I think you have two things going on there. You have these kind of ancient traditions around blood and life force, and then you have this decomposition process that goes on.
The scientific answer.
Right. So I think it combines. Yeah. I think it sort of combines to really, kind of resonate with the people who are looking at that. Go, there it is. In terms of how long they could last, it's hard to say. Like, the village was usually more concerned with just putting an end to it because they thought they might be wiped out. But there were different beliefs around like the lifespan of a vampire. Some kind of had them living on indefinitely. Some had them they kind of had a set lifespan and stuff like that. It actually depended. So it was kind of interesting. But yeah, some vampires were more just thought to like cause illness with that, but the blood drinking might not be mentioned.
Very cool, because you do wonder how long can they go with one feed, and again, those were brought up during Twilight. I'm sorry to keep mentioning that, but I find it amusing.
If we had to try to figure out if someone was a vampire in modern day, what would we be looking for, do you think?
Well,
I know it's a tough one because
I mean, the thing is that I think the notion that there's a vampire living next door or something like in Fright, remember like Fright Night, that movie where the kid thinks there's a vampire next door.
I know.
in
love that
folklore,
movie.
they didn't have have a house and a normal life and stuff like that. They were living in the grave. They were they were coming from the grave to attack people and then going back to the grave. So it wasn't like that person that didn't really come up very much. Like that person down the street might be a vampire. It was more like someone, like a local person who has recently passed away might be causing this calamity that's befallen the village. We need to go to the cemetery, dig some people up, and figure out what's going on. So because
that wouldn't get you arrested in modern times.
Yeah,
you're just gonna go dig Buddy up and figure out what's going on.
These are the folkloric beliefs of the past. Do not do anything. Don't do anything.
They said you have a hot guy living next door,
like just today. But I don't think you need to.
He dresses so sharply.
I think they've evolved. Modern day vampires, they evolve with the times, so they could blend in easily. They would live in modern neighborhoods, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, and a lot of it comes back to like the literature from the 1800s, where you needed a vampire that fit into society to be kind of interesting and relevant to the readers of that time, because they probably weren't at that point. They weren't interested in just it's coming from the grave and then goes back to the grave. That didn't resonate with them. Yeah. Someone at a party who they don't know, who seems mysterious. That could be a vampire. That's what the readers wanted, and so that's the direction it went in.
No, you're not wrong. Go ahead.
Sorry. Jonathan Silva writes, I find it interesting how demons are referred to as energy vampires, while vampires are known for taking blood as a life force. Makes you wonder if they're the same entity or from the same realm.
Well, there are modern day vampires that call themselves energy vampires, I believe.
Yes.
Well, there are, yeah.
They're online. They're online. You can find them on Facebook, actually. There's a group. You can find them on Facebook. I'm not lying. I've come across it.
Again, you're just taking energy in a different way, taking life force in a different way.
Yeah, there are people who believe that they need to take the energy, take energy from other people to feel, normal or good or that kind of thing. I mean, the demon connection is interesting. I mean, hundreds of years ago, that was something that was kind of debated a bit. There was a church scholar who wrote this book about various paranormal things, demons and vampires was talked about, and he wonders. He was a French abbot, Dom Augustin Calmet. He wondered if vampires were the work of the devil, that the devil was causing vampires, thus, if this was the work of the devil, then he felt it was the church's responsibility to deal with it. While if it was just misinterpretations, misunderstandings of the dead and nothing real, he also thought, well, then we need to educate people. The church should set people straight on this. But yeah, so he sort of had different hypotheses about maybe it's the devil is just. It could even be an illusion that's just being created, like it's not an actual thing and stuff like that. So he had some different ideas about it.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
that's interesting. It makes you wonder if there's any accounts out there. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to read the comment because Cadillac Glider 03 has been making comments, and I'm not ignoring. I'm just trying to fit in. But they did write, "Life is stranger than fiction, and truer words have not been said."
Indeed.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just United Public Radio.
Public Radio. It's just Joe. Yummy.
I'm going, what is that?
For the blood. The blood. Battery's eating. Yeah, because he's following the drinking blood thing. That's why.
Of course he is.
He's in New Orleans, so he would know a lot about that.
There you go.
I know. See, that's what I mean. He's from New Orleans. A whole
Finding the
breed.
answers.
I know. So what next for you, AP? What's next for you with this?
I have a blog called locationsoflore.com where I write about different kind of places I've been that might have sort of legends or folklore attached to them, that kind of thing. I share some pictures and stuff. So I've got a backlog of different articles or blog posts I want to write for that. I got a few different book ideas kind of rattling around in my head. I sort of maybe gotta figure out what direction I want to go in there. There's a few different things, but it's quite the endeavor writing a book. It takes a lot out of you, so
it does. But
daunting.
We're in COVID jail now, so you probably have a little bit more time.
This lockdown is killing us.
I know. I'm just trying to see here if I had you coming back on. Maybe we have to just rebook and maybe talk about some of your other lore that
Sure.
you're doing. That might be kind of fun.
Sure. Yeah. No, that'd be great.
All right, I'll have to talk to your people, I guess, again to make that happen. You got
Absolutely.
a people. No, that's good. I love it. I love it. So tell everybody how to find you, and if there's any last minute questions in the chat, now would be a good time. So
Great. Yeah, great. Well, thank you. So, my book is called "Vampires of Lore: Traits and Modern Misconceptions," and you can find it on various websites, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. My website is locationsoflore.com, and on there, I've got info about the book. I've got posts about different places, and I also have links to my social media, so Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
wow,
The
that's
locations of lore. I'm going to put it in the chat room.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Joe, yes, we do. We get loaded and the vampires drink our blood so they can partake in the party. All right. New Orleans.
He doesn't even drink. That's the funny part.
New Orleans. Yeah, you're a whole other world down there. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
But he doesn't drink. Okay, we've got that on there. And Zachman said, thank you for answering my questions, AP. Thank you to everybody in the chat room.
Yeah, really active tonight. That's great. Obviously, somebody very interested in the topic, and I thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this. It was just a lot of fun and very informative.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and this was great. I had a great time chatting with you.
Oh, thank you. Equally for us as well. Like I said, we'll definitely do this again. It was kind of nice to know, like, the other weird kids are out there too, right? But it's kind of like to know, you kind of have a little bit of a kinship when you meet another weird kid who's like 9 and into, like the technicalities of vampires.
Where were you when I was little?
I know, right? Like,
you would have saved me so much therapy.
There you go.
Yeah.
You probably weren't born yet, but still, I'm like, oh my God.
So, but thank you. And we will do this again, and I will be in touch, and we will definitely book you again.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Have a great night. Stay safe and well.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Well, we have come to the end of a fantastic segment here on the Outer Realm. Fantastic as always. Thank you to AP Sylvia. Just really a breath of fresh air. It was just a lot of fun. And, thanks to Joe for hamming it up in the chat room and behind the scenes, I'm sure. Huge thank you to Folgers Coffee for partially sponsoring tonight's show. It's just always such a privilege to be here on your behalf. Remember to stop by the United Public Radio Network YouTube channel, subscribe, get a membership. If you have any questions for us or for some of our guests, past and future, you want to be on the show or you'd like to see someone on the show, stop by the Outer Realm and the group page, or go to the Outer Realm contact at gmail.com. A lot of people are using the email address. So again, the Outer Realm contact at gmail.com. I'm guaranteed to see it there. So tune in next week as we have 2 more amazing guests. We will be bringing to you on Wednesday evening Miss Lynn Russell. So we're going to be talking near-death experiences, and she is said to be an expert on the topic. So she's just really delightful. And on Thursday, we will be bringing to you Elliot Van Dusen. Yeah, it's going to be one really awesome segment. So until then, Amelia and I thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we shall see you next week. Thank you and good night.